In 1631, the quiet Irish village of Baltimore was attacked before dawn. Within hours, 237 men, women, and children were taken across the sea, never to return. This cinematic documentary explores the hidden history of the Barbary corsair raids, the trans-Mediterranean slave trade that affected over 1 million Europeans, and the forgotten testimonies of women who vanished behind the walls of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Through historical records, ransom archives, and rare manuscripts, we uncover what happened after the ships left Ireland, from open slave markets to locked harems, from diplomatic negotiations to the silence that followed. This is not fiction. This is documented history, rarely discussed. Often overlooked. Watch until the end to understand why this chapter faded from European memory. If you enjoy dark, atmospheric historical documentaries, subscribe for more untold stories. The night the sea walked ashore at 3 a.m, the ocean didn't sound like waves. It sounded like wood breaking. Baltimore didn't get robbed, it got erased. And one girl named Bridget learned the oldest rule of the coast: the sea can take you and never return your name. The harvest season of 1631 should have meant full nets, salted fish, and smoke rising from calm chimneys. But Baltimore, a small Irish fishing village tucked along the coast of County Cork, was sleeping with the naive comfort of people who believed the world ended at the horizon. Bridget did too. She had lived her whole life measuring time by tides and church bells, by the same neighbors passing the same stone walls, by a coastline that felt like a protective edge rather than an open door for predators. Then the sound came: sharp, wrong, impossible splintering wood, followed by a chorus of voices she couldn't place. Not English, not Irish, not anything she had ever heard in the market or at the docks. The first scream wasn't hers. It was a man's, chopped short, as if a hand had covered his mouth. And that was when Bridget sat up and saw the light. Torches moving like insects through the dark, bending around corners, multiplying, coordinated, purposeful. This wasn't a drunken brawl or a local feud. This was a raid. Her father's door shook once, twice, and then the lock gave way like it had been made of bread. Shadows poured in, men with curved blades and hard eyes, their faces half hidden by scarves, the firelight turning them into something between soldiers and ghosts. Bridget's mother reached for her, but a gloved hand ripped her away, so fast her nails scraped Bridget's sleeve, leaving a thin tear like a final signature. Outside, thatched roofs caught instantly, the village becoming a map of flames, each cottage a beacon, telling the rest of the coast too late that the nightmare had arrived. Bridget was dragged barefoot over stones still cold from night air, past the church where she had been baptized, past the harbor where she had watched boats come and go, and now the boats were different low, fast silhouettes sitting in black water like waiting mouths. People stumbled in lines, wrists bound, hair grabbed, prayers swallowed by panic. Men who resisted were struck down quickly, not out of rage, but out of efficiency, because hesitation was expensive, and bodies were the true currency. Bridget tried to fix her eyes on something normal, a familiar post. A known face, but everything familiar was breaking apart. Neighbors shoved into darkness. Children lifted like sacks, elders thrown aside because weakness had no price. She heard a word repeated by the raiders, a name spoken with the confidence of men who followed orders. Murad, and she didn't know it then. But that name belonged to a corsair commander with charts, informants, and a business plan. These weren't random thieves. They were professionals who studied coastlines the way butchers study cuts of meat. By the time the first pale line of dawn began to press against the sky, Baltimore was no longer a village, it was a smoking question. And the answer was missing. 237 people gone, loaded onto ships like cargo. The sea swallowing their footprints, before the sun could witness the crime. Bridget was shoved onto the deck, ropes biting into her wrists. And as the sails caught the wind, and Ireland began shrinking into a dark line behind her, she saw something that froze the blood in her veins, a second set of lights far off on the coast. As if another village was about to wake up screaming next. Asterisk, the industry of chains. This was not chaos. It was accounting. Not rage but revenue. The sea did not steal Bridget. It processed her dot when the Irish coastline dissolved into a thin gray scar behind the ship. Bridget understood something worse than fear. This had been planned long before her village ever heard the first splinter of wood. The men who captured her were not wandering raiders chasing opportunity. They were part of a structure as organized as any navy sailing from London or Madrid. From fortified ports like Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Sahel, fleets operated with permits, investors, and political protection. Governors took their percentage. Admirals charted routes. Dock workers repaired hulls. Blacksmiths forged shackles sized for wrists and ankles. Every link in the chain was literal and economic. For the men on deck, Bridget was not a tragedy, she was inventory. The hold beneath her feet already held dozens of others from Baltimore. Fishermen, mothers, boys barely grown. They were separated quickly, not to be cruel, but to increase market value. Families lowered bargaining power. Isolated individuals sold better. Even grief had a price tag. Below deck, the air thickened with salt and panic. The captives were forced into rows, wrists tied in pairs, ankles looped with rope, a system designed to maximize control while minimizing manpower. The guards spoke in Arabic and Turkish, sometimes switching into broken European phrases when issuing orders. Among them were men who did not look. North African and all light-eyed sailors, whose accents carried hints of Dutch or French origins, renegades, converts, Europeans, who had crossed lines of faith and flagged for profit. They knew how coastal villages thought. They knew which harbors would be unguarded during harvest. They knew that on a quiet September night, Baltimore would sleep. This was not random violence. It was intelligence gathering, turned into action, that the voyage south unfolded like a business transaction. Food was rationed carefully, not to nourish, but to preserve. A dead captive meant lost revenue. A living one could be sold, resold, rented, or exchanged for ransom. Across 2.5 centuries, historians estimate that over 1 million Europeans were captured in similar raids, feeding a trans-Mediterranean economy that blurred the line between piracy and statecraft. For coastal communities from Ireland to Italy, the horizon was no longer romantic. It was a ledger line. Church bells doubled as alarms. Watchtowers rose on cliffs. Families moved inland. Yet the raids continued, adapting like a predator, studying new defenses. If a town built walls, another without walls was chosen. If patrol ships increased, the corsairs waited for storms. If cannons guarded one harbor, a smaller cove 2 miles down became the target. On the third night at sea, Bridget heard something that chilled her more than the darkness. Laughter from above deck, light and relaxed, as if this were routine work completed successfully. To the corsairs, it was. Each captive represented coin flowing upward through layers of authority, enriching men who would never smell the hold or hear the sobbing below. The Mediterranean was not merely water separating continents. It was infrastructure. It connected supply to demand, vulnerability to greed. Somewhere in Algiers, brokers were already preparing spaces in the market. Somewhere in Istanbul, agents were watching auctions for suitable purchases. Bridget did not yet understand the scale of the machine she had entered, but she felt its indifference pressing down on her chest. And as the ship cut steadily toward North Africa, one of the guards lifted the hatch briefly, letting in a blade of sunlight and revealing the coastline ahead white walls rising in tiers, minarets piercing the sky proof that this journey was not ending, only transferring her into the next phase of ownership. The auction under the open sky, they washed her, not to cleanse her, but to raise her price. They untied her. Only so strangers could measure her. Under the sun of Algiers, Bridget learned what it meant to be inspected like livestock. When the ship anchored beneath the white walls of Algiers, the first sensation that struck Bridget was light violent, blinding, merciless after weeks below deck. The harbor churned with movement, sailors shouting in Arabic, porters hauling cargo, merchants gesturing sharply as they negotiated. The city did not feel lawless. It felt organized, deliberate, prosperous. This was not a pirate hideout hidden in shadows. It was a functioning capital, fortified and confident, its economy pulsing with trade that extended deep into the Ottoman world. Bridget and the others were marched down the gangplank in silence, their ankles weak, their skin pale from darkness, and the locals who watched did not recoil in horror. They observed with calculation. New arrivals meant opportunity. Before any sale, there was preparation. The captives were driven into public bathhouses where attendants scrubbed away the filth of the voyage with coarse cloth and cold water. Cuts were salved. Bruises were hidden beneath clean fabric. Hair was combed roughly, as if straightening merchandise before display. No one asked their names. Names were sentimental. Names did not increase bids. The goal was simple: preserve value. Bridget stood rigid as strangers examined her arms, her shoulders, her teeth. She understood none of the words, but she understood the tone assessing, clinical, transactional. The bathhouse floor ran slick with water and humiliation. Then came the market itself. It was held in open daylight, in a square framed by whitewashed buildings and shaded arcades. There were no secret chambers for this part of the process. Buyers preferred transparency. Platforms had been erected in the center, wooden stages where captives were brought one by one. Men gathered around in loose circles, some richly dressed in layered robes and turbans, others in simpler garments that marked them as traders or minor officials. Bridget's wrists were untied, but not out of mercy. It allowed her to stand straight and be turned in place. The auctioneer shouted numbers in a rhythmic cadence, and hands rose in response. A murmur passed through the crowd as buyers stepped closer, prodding muscle, tilting chins upward, inspecting teeth as though judging a horse. If a captive flinched or tried to cover herself, a handler corrected her swiftly. A reminder delivered with the back of a hand that resistance lowered price. Foreign observers had written about scenes like this with disbelief. But here it was normal. Taxes were collected on each sale. Clerks recorded transactions. Brokers facilitated negotiations. It was not chaos. It was commerce. Bridget felt the shift from fear to something colder displacement. She was no longer part of a burning village or a dark hold at sea. She was a unit in a marketplace that had operated for generations. Around her stood women from Spain, Italy, France, their accents different, but their silence the same. Some stared at the ground. Others stared straight ahead, as if memorizing the sky might anchor them to something familiar. The bidding around Bridget intensified. She heard the tone rise, saw two men arguing briefly before one lifted his hand higher than the other dared. The auctioneer struck his staff against the platform, sealing the exchange with a sound that echoed louder than any scream. A chain was fastened lightly to her wrist, not heavy, just enough to guide her forward. She did not know the man who had purchased her, did not know his language, his city, or his intentions. She only knew that as she was led away from the square, past the crowds, and into a shaded alley beyond public view, the worst part of her captivity had not happened on the ship or on the platform. It was waiting behind a door she had not yet seen. Asterisk, the door that locks from the outside, behind silk. Curtains there were no fairy tales, only rules. Behind perfumed walls there was no romance, only control. And once the door closed, Bridget understood the most terrifying truth. Captivity can be quiet. The residence in Istanbul did not look like a prison from the outside. It rose with carved balconies and patterned tiles, its inner courtyard lined with citrus trees and a fountain that murmured softly as if peace lived there. Yet the sound that Bridget noticed most was the turning of a key, the deliberate metal click each time a door shut from the outside. She had survived the market in Algiers, the voyage across the Mediterranean, the humiliation of inspection beneath open sky, but this was different, because here the violence was not loud. It was structured, domestic, woven into daily routine until resistance felt almost irrational. The women who received her did not shout. They assessed. They removed her travel-stained garments and fed them to a brazier without ceremony, the smoke curling upward like the last visible thread connecting her to Ireland. They bathed her, dressed her in Ottoman fabrics, taught her the first words she would need to survive stand, kneel, ring. Wait each instruction delivered with a firm grip that left no doubt about consequences. In the polished metal mirror they held before her, she saw a stranger shaped into someone acceptable to this household, and that transformation was the first stage of erasure. Hussein Aga, her owner, was not a monster in appearance. He was a merchant, a man accustomed to contracts and shipments, to grain prices and textile routes, and that normality unsettled her more than rage would have, because it proved that cruelty did not require madness, only permission. Inside the harem quarters, hierarchy ruled everything. Older women supervised younger ones with disciplined authority, deciding who cleaned, who prepared meals, who learned music, who might someday be presented as a concubine. Bridget began at the bottom, scrubbing floors in silence, learning quickly that mistakes were corrected physically, and that obedience, not emotion, earned temporary relief. The other women spoke in fragments of languages Greek, Italian, Russian, each carrying their own lost coastline within them, yet none dared speak too loudly of home. Memory was both comfort and liability. If overheard, it could be interpreted as defiance. Conversion hovered constantly over daily life, not as a single demand, but as steady pressure. Accepting Islam did not mean freedom. It meant marginally better conditions, perhaps lighter tasks, perhaps protection from harsher discipline. But refusal marked a woman as stubborn, and stubbornness invited punishment. Some resisted openly until exhaustion bent their will. Others whispered prayers in their native tongue while reciting new ones aloud, living in dual belief as a strategy of survival. The law offered no shelter. A slave woman could not testify against a free man, could not claim injury as injustice, could not leave the compound without escort. On paper, she was property, and property did not possess grievance. Yet the greatest tension lived in uncertainty. Among hundreds within greater imperial harems, only a fraction would ever see the sultan. In private households like this one, favor shifted without warning. A woman who bore a son might gain protection and status. One who failed could be resold as easily as grain changing hands in a dockside ledger. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered rumor carried weight. Bridget learned to read footsteps in the corridor, to sense mood in silence, to shrink herself when necessary, and appear attentive when summoned. Survival became performance. Night after night, when the oil lamps dimmed and the courtyard stilled, she lay awake listening for the approach of that key, knowing that the door would open again, not because of love or choice, but because ownership demanded use. And as the handle began to turn once more, she realized something colder than fear. In this place, hope itself had to be rationed. The priests who bargained with kings across the sea, names were written in ink, like gravestones without bodies. Hope traveled not by sword, but by coin. And somewhere between ransom and silence, Bridget's name resurfaced, while Bridget measured her days by footsteps in corridors and the scrape of keys against locks. Far beyond the walls of Istanbul, another struggle unfolded, one waged not with cannons, but with parchment and prayer. In cities like Rome, Paris, Madrid, and even London, religious orders dedicated themselves to a single purpose: the redemption of captives taken by the Barbary corsairs. Trinitarian and Mercedarian priests traveled into North Africa carrying letters of credit, church funds, and fragile promises, negotiating face-to-face with the very authorities who profited from human bondage. They compiled lists of the disappeared, names gathered from sobbing relatives along European coastlines, mothers clutching rosaries, fathers who had searched the horizon until their eyes failed. Each name was copied carefully into ledgers, a desperate attempt to hold on to identity in a system designed to erase it. But ransom was mathematics. Wealthy captives were prioritized. Sailors with families who could raise funds stood a better chance than poor villagers whose communities had already been burned. A merchant's daughter might be redeemed within months if her kin could pay. A fisherman's child from rural Ireland might remain in bondage for decades, not because she was forgotten emotionally, but because she was financially unreachable. Governments issued proclamations condemning the raids, yet diplomacy often outweighed rescue. Trade agreements with Ottoman authorities mattered. Wars closer to home drained treasuries. Public outrage flared and faded. The Mediterranean machine kept turning. Records from the 1630s describe priests entering Algiers markets, scrutinizing auctions, whispering to captives in broken languages, asking for names, origins, parish details. Some women collapsed in tears at the sight of a European face wearing a crucifix openly. Others were too frightened to speak, unsure whether hope itself was a trap. If a ransom could be negotiated, a captive was escorted out in quiet ceremony, often skeletal, often changed beyond recognition. Those not selected watched from behind lattice screens, learning that salvation was possible but not guaranteed. Hope became another form of suspense. Years passed in Istanbul before Bridget's name appeared on one of those lists. It traveled through a network of sailors, intermediaries, and priests who documented that a young woman from Baltimore, taken in 1631, was now in the household of a merchant, tied loosely to imperial trade routes. A letter was attempted. In it, written in trembling script and smuggled through channels meant for redemption cases, Bridget tried to describe her life. She mentioned survival, routine, the pressure to abandon her faith, and the absence of choice. Midway through the account, the handwriting faltered, as if the memory itself resisted ink. The final lines were sparse, restrained, suggesting that some experiences defied translation. That letter reached Europe, but it did not immediately trigger rescue. Ransom negotiations were delicate. Owners inflated prices once they sensed foreign interest. Some captives were moved deliberately to prevent recovery, sold again to increase leverage. And whispers circulated inside the household that outside inquiries had been made, that someone far away was asking questions. Questions could be dangerous. A slave valuable for domestic stability could become inconvenient if she attracted foreign attention. Bridget noticed the shift first in tone, then in supervision. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. And one evening she overheard a single word repeated with quiet irritation: redeem. That night, as she lay awake in the dim courtyard light, she understood something chilling. If freedom came too close, it might provoke those who preferred silence. And somewhere beyond those locked doors, a negotiation had begun that would decide whether her name remained ink on a list or was erased entirely. Asterisk. The silence Europe chose. Some women came home, but never returned. Some names were redeemed. Others dissolved into foreign air. And the most haunting truth is not what was done to them, but how easily they were forgotten. The negotiations over Bridget's freedom did not unfold like a heroic rescue carved into legend. They moved quietly, buried beneath trade agreements and political caution, because by the mid-17th century, Europe had grown accustomed to the rhythm of loss along its shores. Letters passed between clerics and intermediaries. Sums were proposed and rejected, counteroffers made, but every discussion depended on the cold arithmetic of value, and value shifted constantly depending on age, usefulness, and whether an owner sensed leverage. Bridget had survived years inside walls that reshaped her habits, her language, even her posture. She had learned when to speak, and when silence preserved safety, and in that silence she carried Ireland like a fading photograph, edges softening with time. When word finally reached her that ransom had been arranged, she did not collapse with joy. She reacted with disbelief, because hope in captivity can be more dangerous than despair, and she had trained herself not to trust it. The departure from the household was procedural rather than dramatic, overseen by officials who treated the exchange like a business transaction concluding. Coin counted, receipt acknowledged, and then she was escorted toward a ship bound west. Not as cargo, this time, but as redeemed, property returning to a continent that had never stopped debating her price. The journey back across the Mediterranean did not erase what had been done. It only reversed direction. Bridget stood on deck under open sky, free in legal terms yet uncertain in spirit, because years inside confinement alter a person in ways no ransom can repay. When she reached European soil, she encountered something almost as unsettling as captivity: distance. People listened to her story with fascination, sometimes horror, sometimes skepticism, but rarely comprehension. Coastal communities had their own scars, their own missing daughters and sons, and while churches prayed publicly for captives, political leaders weighed costs privately. Naval expeditions were discussed, alliances negotiated. Yet for decades, the raids continued because the machinery of profit on both sides of the sea proved resilient. Bridget attempted to write about her experience, producing a testimony that survives only in fragments, sentences that begin with clarity and end in abrupt silence, as if language itself faltered under memory's weight. She described fear, routine, coercion, the constant awareness of being owned. But in the margins, her script tightened, words shrinking as though she were still conserving space. Historians today piece together such fragments from ransom records, diplomatic correspondence, Ottoman archives, and church ledgers, reconstructing a pattern that stretched from Ireland to Iceland, from Italy to England, affecting over 1 million Europeans between the 16th and 18th centuries. The Mediterranean was not merely a cultural crossroads. It was an arena where commerce and captivity intertwined, and the suffering of women like Bridget rarely occupied official histories that preferred tales of empire and naval glory. When Europe later expanded its own systems of slavery across oceans, collective memory became selective, emphasizing certain narratives while muting others that complicated moral identity. Bridget lived long enough to see coastal defenses strengthen and naval patrols grow bolder. Yet she also lived with the knowledge that many women never returned, their names absorbed into foreign households, their children raised in new faiths, their original languages forgotten. In the end, the most unsettling revelation is not simply that Barbary corsairs captured Irish women in 1631, but that the story faded because it did not fit neatly into heroic national myths. Bridget's life became a quiet testament rather than a monument. Her survival neither celebrated widely nor entirely ignored, existing in that uneasy space between remembrance and convenience. And as the centuries turned, the sea continued to glitter under sunrise, indifferent to what it had carried, while history chose which wounds to illuminate and which to leave beneath the surface. where silence can feel almost like absolution.